I was scrubbing floors in a mansion when I saw it, a tattoo on his wrist that made my blood run cold, the same symbol from my nightmares, the same mark I'd seen before everything went dark 3 years ago. He thought I was just the maid, but that tattoo proved I was his missing wife. Stay with me because what happens next will blow your mind. You won't believe how this tattoo connects to a $1 billion empire and a love story that was supposed to stay buried forever. My name is Brooklyn, or at least that's what I've been calling myself for the past 3 years. I work as a maid in one of the most expensive penthouses in the city, cleaning up after people who make more money in a day than I see in a year. The irony of my situation would have been laughable if I knew it then. But I didn't know anything about my past, not really. My memories only went back 3 years, to the day I woke up in a hospital bed with no identification and no one looking for me. The doctors said I had amnesia from a severe head injury. They kept me for weeks, hoping someone would come forward to claim me, but no one ever did. When I was discharged, I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a name I'd given myself because I had to call myself something. Brooklyn felt right somehow, like it meant something to me, though I couldn't remember why. I'd been working at the Sterling penthouse for 6 months when everything changed. The other staff always talked about Mr. Sterling in hushed whispers, like he was some kind of myth. He owned the entire building, they said, along with half the city. A tech mogul worth billions who rarely showed his face. In all my time there, I'd never seen him once. He traveled constantly, lived in his other homes, and when he was in town, he kept to his private floors that we weren't allowed to access. The penthouse I cleaned was supposedly his main residence, but it felt more like a museum. Everything was perfect, untouched, like it was waiting for someone to come home. There was a sadness to the place that I couldn't shake, especially when I cleaned the master bedroom. It was clearly meant for 2 people, but only one side of the bed ever looked used. The other side had a layer of dust that suggested it had been empty for years. That Tuesday started like any other. I was cleaning his study, dusting the expensive books and wiping down the mahogany desk that probably cost more than my annual salary. The room was my favorite to clean because it had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. I often found myself pausing to stare at the view, wondering if I'd ever lived somewhere with windows like these before my accident. I was reaching for a book on the highest shelf when I heard the elevator doors open. My heart jumped into my throat because no one was supposed to be home. Martha, the head housekeeper, had specifically told me Mr. Sterling was in London for the week. I quickly grabbed my cleaning supplies, hoping to slip out before whoever it was saw me. But as I turned toward the door, he walked in. Adrian Sterling. I'd seen his picture in magazines and newspapers, but seeing him in person was completely different. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that was perfectly styled but looked like he'd been running his hands through it. He wore an expensive suit that fit him like it was made for his body, which it probably was. But what struck me most were his eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, and they looked tired, like they'd seen too much. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," I stammered, clutching my cleaning supplies. "I didn't know you were back. It's fine," he said, his voice deeper than I'd expected. "Don't let me interrupt." But I was already moving toward the door, too nervous to stay in the same room as him. As I passed by him, I stumbled slightly, and some of my cleaning supplies clattered to the floor. Without thinking, he bent down to help me gather them up, and that's when I saw it. The tattoo was on his left wrist, just below his watch. It was intricate and beautiful. 2 snakes intertwined around a blooming rose, with delicate thorns and leaves weaving through the design. The artwork was stunning, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the familiarity of it, the way it made something deep in my chest tighten with recognition. "Thank you," I whispered, taking the cleaning spray from his hand. Our fingers brushed for just a moment, and I felt a jolt of electricity that made me pull back quickly. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Have we met before?" "No, sir, I don't think so." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. There was something about his face, about the way he looked at me, that felt familiar in a way that made my head pound. "What's your name?" "Brooklyn," I said, and something flickered in his eyes. "Brooklyn," he repeated, like he was testing how it sounded. "That's a beautiful name." I mumbled another thank you and practically ran from the room, my heart beating so fast I thought it might burst. But it wasn't embarrassment that was making my pulse race. It was fear. Fear of the way that tattoo had looked so familiar. Fear of the recognition I'd seen in his eyes. And most of all, fear of the headache that was building behind my temples like a storm. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tattoo. The snakes seemed to move in my memory, coiling around the rose like they were protecting it. And with the image came flashes of other things, gentle hands, whispered words I couldn't quite make out, and a feeling of safety that I hadn't felt since waking up in that hospital bed. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed to understand what was happening to me, why seeing that tattoo had affected me so strongly. I spent the day at the library, using their computers to research Adrian Sterling. What I found made my blood run cold. Adrian Sterling, 32 years old, CEO of Sterling Technologies, worth an estimated $2.8 billion. But it was the personal information that made my hands shake as I read. 3 years ago, his wife had disappeared after a car accident. Her name was Elena Sterling, and she'd been 26 when she vanished from the hospital where she was being treated for her injuries. The photos of Elena were frustratingly unclear, always taken from a distance or at an angle that obscured her face. But what I could see made my stomach churn. She had long, dark hair like mine. She was about my height, my build. And in one photo, I could see her hand resting on Adrian's chest, and on her ring finger was a wedding band that made my breath catch. The article described how Elena had disappeared from her hospital room in the middle of the night, leaving behind no trace. The police had investigated, but there were no leads. Some speculated she'd been kidnapped, others suggested she'd run away, but Adrian Sterling had never stopped looking for her. He'd hired private investigators, offered rewards, and refused to declare her dead even after all this time. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, trying to make sense of what I was reading. The timeline matched perfectly with my own missing memories. Elena Sterling had disappeared 3 years ago, the same time I'd woken up in a hospital with no memory of who I was. But that had to be a coincidence, right? There was no way I could be the missing wife of a billionaire. But the more I thought about it, the more pieces seemed to fit. The way Adrian had looked at me, the familiarity of his tattoo, the reason I'd felt so drawn to that penthouse. And then there was the name, Brooklyn. What if it wasn't random? What if it meant something to Elena Sterling? I spent the rest of the week researching everything I could find about Elena Sterling and her disappearance. I learned that she'd been an artist, that she'd grown up in foster care, that she'd met Adrian when she was working as a waitress, and he was building his first company. Their love story had been the stuff of fairy tales, the brilliant entrepreneur and the beautiful artist who'd captured his heart. But the more I read, the more questions I had. Why had no one recognized me if I was Elena Sterling? Why hadn't Adrian seemed to know who I was when he saw me? And most importantly, why couldn't I remember any of it? It was Martha who gave me the first real clue. Martha had been the head housekeeper at the Sterling penthouse for 20 years, and she'd seen everything. She was a kind woman in her 60s who'd always been nice to me, and I'd grown to trust her during my months working there. "You've been different lately," she said one afternoon as we were folding laundry together. "Distracted. Everything all right?" I hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Martha, what was Mrs. Sterling like? Elena?" Her face softened with sadness. "Oh, she was wonderful. So kind and gentle. She used to paint in the studio upstairs. Mr. Sterling had it specially made for her. She was talented, really talented, and she loved him so much." She paused, wiping her eyes. "It nearly destroyed him when she disappeared. He's never been the same." "The studio upstairs?" I asked, my heart starting to race again. "On the 42nd floor. It's been locked up since she disappeared. Mr. Sterling can't bear to go in there, but he won't let anyone else touch it either. Says he's keeping it exactly as she left it, in case she comes back." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the studio. I had a key card that gave me access to most of the penthouse, and I knew the security cameras were limited in the upper floors. It was wrong, I knew it was wrong, but I had to see that studio. Something deep inside me was pulling me toward it, like a magnet drawing me home. I waited until after midnight, when I knew the building would be quiet. The 42nd floor was smaller than the others, with just a few rooms. I found the studio at the end of the hall, and my keycard worked on the lock. The door opened with a soft click, and I stepped inside. The room took my breath away. It was bathed in moonlight from the skylights above, and every surface was covered with art supplies, canvases, and paintings. The air smelled like turpentine and roses, and there was a presence in the room that made my skin tingle with recognition. I walked slowly through the space, looking at the paintings propped against the walls. They were beautiful, landscapes and portraits and abstract pieces that seemed to capture emotion in color and light, and they were all signed E.S. in the bottom right corner. But it was the painting on the easel that made me stop breathing. It was a portrait of Adrian, but not the formal, distant version I'd seen in photographs. This Adrian was laughing, his eyes crinkled with joy, and on his wrist was the same tattoo I'd seen just days before. The snakes and rose were painted in perfect detail, and I could see every line and shadow. Beneath the painting, on the small table next to the easel, was a leather journal. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and flowing, and it was definitely feminine. But what made my legs give out was that I recognized it. It was my handwriting. Adrian surprised me today by showing me his tattoo. He said he designed it himself, based on something I drew for him when we first met. The snakes represent protection, and the rose represents love. He said he wanted to carry a piece of me with him always, even when we're apart. I cried when I saw it because I've never had anyone love me like this before. The entry was dated 4 years ago, a year before Elena Sterling had disappeared. I flipped through the pages with trembling fingers, reading entry after entry in my own handwriting, describing a life I couldn't remember living. We talked about children today. Adrian wants 3, I want 2. We compromised on 4. He's working too hard again. I left a rose on his desk with a note telling him to come home early. He did. I'm scared sometimes that this is all a dream, that I'll wake up and be back in foster care, and none of this will be real. But then Adrian holds me and tells me I'm home, and I believe him. The last entry was dated just 2 days before the accident. I've been having the strangest dreams lately, dark dreams where I'm lost and can't find my way home. Adrian says it's just stress from the gallery opening, but they feel so real. I wake up scared and confused, like I'm forgetting something important. But when I see Adrian's tattoo, I remember who I am. I remember that I'm loved. I sat on the floor of the studio, surrounded by the artwork and memories of a life I'd lived but couldn't remember, and I cried. Not gentle tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from deep in your chest when you realize your entire world has been turned upside down. I was Elena Sterling. I was the missing wife of a billionaire, and I'd been cleaning my own home for 6 months without knowing it. The accident had taken my memories, and somehow I'd ended up in a different hospital, with a different identity, living a completely different life. But if I was Elena Sterling, why hadn't Adrian recognized me? Why had he looked at me like I was a stranger? And why hadn't anyone else in the building known who I was? The next morning, I called in sick again. I needed to confront Adrian, but I needed to do it carefully. I couldn't just walk up to him and announce that I was his missing wife. He'd think I was insane. I needed proof, and I needed to understand why he hadn't recognized me. I went back to the library and did more research, this time focusing on the details of Elena Sterling's disappearance. What I found made everything click into place. Elena had been in a car accident during a rainstorm. She'd been taken to St. Mary's Hospital, where she was treated for severe head trauma and a broken arm. But according to the police report, she'd disappeared from her hospital room during a shift change, and no one had seen her leave. But I knew where she'd gone, because I knew where I'd woken up. I'd been found 3 days later at General Hospital, 15 miles away, with no memory and no identification. The doctors there had assumed I was a Jane Doe, someone who'd been in an accident and hadn't been reported missing. They'd never connected me to Elena Sterling because why would they? A billionaire's wife wouldn't end up at a public hospital with no insurance and no family looking for her. But how had I gotten from St. Mary's to General, and why had my appearance changed enough that no one recognized me? The answer, I realized, was probably simpler than I'd thought. Head trauma could change someone's face through swelling and bruising. 3 years of living a different life, eating different food, and being under constant stress could change someone's body. And hair could be cut and styled differently. I wasn't the same person physically that Elena Sterling had been, but I was still her, and the tattoo, Adrian's tattoo, was the key to proving it. That evening I waited outside the Sterling building until I saw Adrian's car pull up. I followed him into the elevator, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Brooklyn," he said, sounding surprised to see me. "What are you doing here so late?" "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "About your tattoo." The elevator went very quiet. Adrian stared at me with those storm-gray eyes, and I saw something shift in his expression. "What about it?" "I've seen it before," I said. "Not just the other day, but before. In my dreams, in flashes of memory that don't make sense. And I think I know why." The elevator reached his floor, but neither of us moved to get out. Adrian hit the button to keep the doors closed, and when he looked at me again, there was something desperate in his eyes. "Tell me," he said. "I found the studio," I said. "The one on the 42nd floor. I found the paintings, and the journal, and the portrait of you with your tattoo. I found them, and I recognize the handwriting because it's mine." Adrian's face went white. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo I'd taken of one of the journal entries. "This is my handwriting, Adrian. I wrote this. I painted that portrait. I designed that tattoo you're wearing." He stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked back at me. Really looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Elena?" he whispered. "I think so," I said. "I think I'm Elena Sterling, and I think I've been lost for 3 years. But I need you to help me remember." Adrian's hands were shaking as he reached for my face, his fingers tracing my cheekbones like he was trying to memorize them. "I looked for you," he said, his voice breaking. "I looked everywhere. I hired investigators. I offered rewards. I never stopped believing you were alive. But when I saw you here, I thought I was losing my mind. You looked different, but there was something about you that felt familiar." "The accident," I said. "It changed me. Not just my memories, but my appearance, too. And somehow I ended up at the wrong hospital with the wrong identity." "Show me," he said. "Show me the tattoo design." I pulled out my phone again and showed him the photo I'd taken of the painting. In the portrait, his tattoo was clearly visible and every detail was perfect. "You painted this," he said. "You painted me with the tattoo you designed." "I did," I said, and as I said it, I felt a shift in my mind. Like a door that had been locked for 3 years was finally opening. Adrian traced the tattoo on his wrist, and as he did, my memories began to flood back. Not all at once, but in waves that made me gasp with recognition. I remembered meeting him at the diner where I worked, how he'd come in every morning for coffee and always sat in my section. I remembered the first time he'd asked me out, how nervous he'd been despite being worth millions even then. I remembered designing the tattoo for him, how he'd wanted something that represented our love and would remind him of me when we were apart. I remembered our wedding day, small and simple because neither of us had family, but perfect because we had each other. I remembered the penthouse, how overwhelmed I'd been the first time he'd brought me there, how he'd told me it was ours and I could change anything I wanted. I remembered the studio, how he'd surprised me with it on our first anniversary, how I'd cried because no one had ever believed in my art the way he did. I remembered painting that portrait of him, how he'd posed for me with that lazy smile that made my heart race. And I remembered the accident, the rain, the slippery roads, the way our car had spun out of control. I remembered waking up in the hospital, confused and scared, and how Adrian had held my hand and promised everything would be okay. But then there was darkness, and when I woke up again, I was in a different place with different people, and Adrian was gone. I remember, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I remember everything. Adrian pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was home. I never stopped loving you, he said into my hair. I never stopped hoping you'd come back to me. I'm sorry, I said. I'm so sorry I left you. You didn't leave me, he said, pulling back to look at me. You were taken from me, but you found your way back. You came home. We stood there in the elevator, holding each other and crying, and I realized that sometimes love really is stronger than time or memory or circumstance. Sometimes it's written in the stars, or in this case, tattooed on someone's skin, a permanent reminder of a love that was meant to last forever. The tattoo hadn't just been artwork, it had been a promise, a covenant, a way for Adrian to carry me with him always. And in the end, it had been the key that brought me back to him, the thread that connected my lost memories to my true identity. I was Elena Sterling. I was home, and I was loved. Can you imagine living as someone else for 3 years, only to discover you were married to a billionaire? That tattoo wasn't just ink. It was a love letter written on skin. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. And tell me in the comments, do you believe in fate? Because this story proves that love always finds a way back home.